Tyler Briggs let the silence stretch just long enough to make a point, then clicked his pen against the clipboard. "All right, Mr. Harlan," he said, drawing out the name with deliberate boredom. "You want me to pass a message up the chain? That is not how access works. You show credentials. You state business. Then we decide if it is worth anyone's time." The other SEALs shifted closer, boots scraping lightly over sun-baked concrete. One of them folded his arms and studied the older man as if trying to place him, but whatever he was looking for did not appear on the surface. Walter Harlan did not move. The late afternoon light caught the fine lines in his face, the kind carved by decades of weather and long days, not by comfort. His gaze drifted past Briggs for half a second, toward the operations building 50 yards behind the gate. The glass doors reflected the sky like polished steel. "You are deciding," Harlan said evenly, "without knowing what you are deciding." A low chuckle came from behind Briggs. "That sounds important," one of the men muttered. Briggs did not laugh this time. Something about the older man's tone refused to fit the script. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to impress, just quiet certainty. A transport truck rolled slowly down the internal road, engine humming, then disappeared around a corner. The air settled again. "You got prior service?" Briggs asked, eyes narrowing slightly. "Because if this is about a tour or a reunion or whatever nostalgia trip this is, there is an office downtown for that." Harlan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I am not here for nostalgia." The words were soft, but they landed with weight. Briggs tilted his head. "Then what are you here for?" For the first time, Harlan's hand moved toward the small leather holder again. He did not open it. He only rested his thumb against its worn edge, as if grounding himself in something familiar. "Tell your commanding officer that Walter Harlan is standing at his gate," he said. "He will understand." One of the younger SEALs scoffed. "You hear that? He will understand." The laughter returned, thinner now, uncertain around the edges. Briggs studied the man in front of him more carefully. The posture, the stillness, the way he did not blink under scrutiny. Most civilians fidgeted in front of uniforms. Most explained themselves too quickly. Harlan did neither. A faint crackle came from the security booth radio again, a voice half-formed before dissolving into static. Inside the booth, Yeoman Third Class Ethan Cole glanced toward the gate, then back at the console. He had been listening without meaning to. He had heard the name. Harlan. Something about it tugged at a memory he could not quite reach. Briggs finally exhaled through his nose and shifted his weight. "Fine," he said. "You want me to run it? I will run it." He stepped toward the booth, calling over his shoulder, "Do not go anywhere." Harlan gave a faint nod, as if the instruction were unnecessary. Ethan looked up as Briggs entered. "Run a name for me," Briggs said, casual but edged. "Walter Harlan. Claims somebody important will care." Ethan's fingers hovered above the keyboard for a fraction of a second longer than usual. Then he began to type. Outside, beneath the snapping flag and the relentless Texas sun, Walter Harlan waited without moving, as though he had done this before and knew exactly how long silence could last. Ethan Cole watched the cursor blink beside the name on his screen, the letters stark against the secure database interface. Walter Harlan. He expected nothing. A retired logistics clerk. A short enlistment from decades ago. Maybe nothing at all. His fingers moved across the keyboard, entering the name into the personnel archive first. No immediate match. He tried again with middle initial fields left blank. Still nothing active. Behind him, Briggs leaned one shoulder against the booth doorway, arms crossed. "See," he said lightly. "Ghost." Ethan did not answer. He shifted to a secondary database, one rarely accessed except for ceremonial verifications or historical research. The system lagged for half a second longer than usual, then prompted for clearance. Ethan swallowed and entered his credentials. The page refreshed. A result appeared. Not a full profile. Just a restricted file marker with a classification notice and a line of text. Access limited to command-level review. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest. That designation did not show up for retirees requesting tours. It did not show up for confused civilians at a gate. He clicked again, attempting to view basic service dates. The screen flashed a warning and locked the entry, automatically flagging the search. Somewhere deeper in the network, a notification would already be traveling upward. "Well?" Briggs asked. Ethan turned slowly in his chair. There is a record, he said carefully. It is restricted. Briggs gave a short laugh. Restricted like everybody who thinks they were special. But Ethan had already reached for the internal line. He pressed the extension for the command duty office, the secure channel reserved for unusual matters. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice answered, crisp and alert. Command duty officer. Ethan kept his eyes on the screen. Sir, this is Yeoman 3rd Class Ethan Cole at Gate 3. I have an individual requesting contact with command. Name is Walter Harlan. There was a pause on the other end. Not confusion. Not impatience. A pause that felt deliberate. Repeat that name, the officer said. Ethan did. The silence that followed stretched longer this time. In the booth doorway, Briggs straightened slightly, sensing the shift. Outside, the low murmur of the SEALs faded as they watched the exchange through the glass. Gate 3. The voice finally replied, tone altered. Is he still there? Ethan glanced toward the older man standing alone in the sunlight. Harlan had not moved. He stood with hands at his sides, eyes fixed forward, as steady as a monument. Yes, sir, Ethan answered. He is waiting. Another pause. Then, quietly, do not detain him. Do not dismiss him. Hold position. I am notifying the captain. The line clicked dead. Ethan lowered the receiver slowly. Briggs searched his face. What did they say? Ethan hesitated for the briefest moment. They said to hold position. Briggs frowned. That is it. Ethan met his eyes. They are notifying Captain Rourke. The name landed heavier than expected. Around them, the air seemed to change temperature without warning. Outside the booth, one of the SEALs glanced toward the operations building as if expecting something to emerge from it. The wind shifted, tugging at the flag overhead with a sharper snap. Briggs stepped back out into the sunlight, expression guarded now. He studied Walter Harlan again, this time without amusement. 50 yards away, the glass doors of the command building opened. A figure in khaki stepped out, moving with purpose toward the gate. And for the first time since the older man had spoken his name, no one at Gate 3 was laughing. Captain Benjamin Rourke did not run, but he moved fast enough that the distance between the command building and Gate 3 seemed to collapse beneath his stride. His khaki uniform was immaculate despite the heat, cover tucked under his arm, sunglasses reflecting the bright Texas sky. 2 steps behind him followed the command master chief, posture rigid, expression unreadable. Conversations along the walkway died mid-sentence as sailors and operators noticed the direction of their movement. At the gate, Tyler Briggs felt his throat tighten without knowing why. He had seen the captain move with purpose before, but never toward a routine gate check. Rourke did not look left or right. His eyes were fixed ahead, locked on the solitary figure standing beyond the security line. Walter Harlan remained exactly where he had been, hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders squared, as though he had expected this approach down to the second. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel from the flight line. 50 yards became 40. 30. No one spoke. Even the hum of distant engines seemed to recede beneath the weight of anticipation. Briggs straightened instinctively, boots aligning, clipboard lowering to his side. The other SEALs followed without being told. The command master chief stopped several paces back, but Captain Rourke continued forward until he stood directly in front of Harlan, separated only by the painted yellow boundary line on the pavement. For a brief moment, neither man said a word. Rourke removed his sunglasses slowly, deliberately, revealing eyes that held recognition rather than curiosity. Sir, he said quietly, voice carrying just enough to reach the men behind him. The single word changed the air. Briggs felt it more than heard it. Rourke stepped across the painted line without hesitation and came to attention. The movement was sharp, precise, practiced over a lifetime. His right hand rose in a crisp salute that cut cleanly through the stillness. The command master chief mirrored him instantly. The sound of their shoes striking together echoed against concrete and steel. For half a heartbeat, the base seemed to stop breathing. Walter Harlan did not rush to respond. He regarded the captain with calm, measured eyes, as if weighing something unseen. Then, slowly, he lifted his own hand. The salute he returned was steady despite the faint tremor in his fingers. It was not exaggerated. It was not theatrical. It was exact. Around them, operators who had faced down stormy seas and relentless training stood motionless, watching. Their commanding officer salute a man they had dismissed minutes earlier. Briggs felt heat rise behind his ears. He replayed every word he had spoken since the older man arrived. Rourke lowered his hand first. "Walter Harlan," he said, voice firm now, resonant. "It is an honor to have you back on this installation." The words were formal, but there was something deeper beneath them, something personal. Harlan allowed the faintest hint of a nod. "Good to see the standards still stand," he replied. Rourke glanced once toward Briggs and the others, not with anger, but with a look that made explanation unnecessary. "Gate 3, he said evenly, without breaking eye contact with his men, "will remain silent unless directed otherwise." The instruction was simple. Its effect was immediate. Conversations across the immediate area ceased completely. Radios went quiet. Movement halted. The base did not erupt. It did not shout. It simply stilled. And in that stillness, every man at the gate understood that the name they had just heard carried a history far heavier than any rank stitched on their uniforms. No one moved until Captain Rourke stepped aside and gestured toward the interior road. "Walk with me, sir," he said, the formality in his voice matched by something that sounded almost like relief. Walter Harlan crossed the painted boundary line without hesitation. The yellow stripe that had separated him from the base minutes earlier now meant nothing. Tyler Briggs felt the weight of that detail settle into his chest. Rourke and Harlan began walking toward the command building, their pace measured, unhurried. The command master chief fell in a respectful step behind them. Around Gate 3, operators instinctively straightened. Conversations remained suspended. Even the usual background noise of a busy installation seemed dialed down, as if the base itself understood that this moment required restraint. Briggs glanced toward Ethan Cole inside the booth. Ethan's expression had changed from curiosity to realization. "Who is he?" one of the SEALs whispered under his breath. Briggs did not answer. 50 yards ahead, Rourke spoke quietly as they walked. "We were not expecting you today." Harlan's eyes traced the perimeter fence, the upgraded cameras, the new construction near the operations wing. "That was the point," he replied. There was no accusation in the words, only observation. "You have expanded," he added. "Yes, sir," Rourke said. "New training facilities. New teams rotating through." Harlan gave a faint nod. "Standards still matter more than facilities." Rourke's jaw tightened slightly, not in offense, but in agreement. "They do," he said. "Because you made sure they did." The words carried farther than intended. Briggs caught them even from a distance. A quiet exchange, but heavy with implication. As they approached the glass doors of the command building, sailors standing nearby came to attention without being told. No announcement had been made over loudspeaker. No explanation had been offered. Yet the reaction spread in widening circles. A lieutenant exiting the building stopped mid-step, eyes widening as he recognized Harlan's face. He stepped aside immediately, posture rigid. Inside, the polished floors reflected overhead lights in clean lines. Harlan paused just beyond the threshold, gaze lifting to a framed wall display of unit insignias mounted along the corridor. His eyes lingered on one emblem in particular. The edges of it had been updated in design over the years, but the core symbol remained. Rourke followed his line of sight. "It is still there," the captain said quietly. Harlan studied it for a long moment. "It should be," he answered. Behind them, the doors closed with a soft hydraulic sigh. Outside at Gate 3, Briggs finally exhaled. The clipboard in his hand felt lighter and heavier at the same time. One of the SEALs shifted uneasily. "You think he was some kind of admiral?" he asked. Briggs shook his head slowly. "No," he said, eyes fixed on the now quiet road leading to the command building. "Something else." He replayed the captain's first word again in his mind. "Sir." Not out of habit, not out of protocol, out of recognition. And as the base resumed its normal rhythm in careful increments, Tyler Briggs understood that what had just unfolded was not about rank stitched on a collar. It was about a name that did not need to be explained because it had already been written into the foundation of the place itself. The corridor inside the command building felt cooler than the air outside, but the temperature shift did nothing to ease the weight of the moment. Captain Benjamin Rourke guided Walter Harlan past framed commendations and photographs that chronicled decades of deployments, training cycles, and quiet achievements that never made headlines. Sailors who passed them slowed instinctively, stepping aside without needing instruction. No one asked questions. They recognized the posture of their commanding officer and the gravity in his stride. Rourke stopped outside a conference room with frosted glass panels. Through the haze, silhouettes of officers could be seen seated around a long table. A briefing had been underway. Rourke opened the door without knocking. Conversation inside cut off mid-sentence. Charts glowed on a wall screen, maps layered with colored markers. Every head turned. Rourke did not announce the visitor. He simply stepped aside. Walter Harlan entered first. For a brief second, confusion flickered across the faces in the room. Then recognition dawned on one of the senior officers seated near the head of the table. The man stood so abruptly that his chair rolled back several inches on the polished floor. "Sir," he said under his breath, the word barely audible yet unmistakable. The rest of the room followed his lead, rising in near unison. Harlan surveyed them quietly. His eyes moved from face to face, measuring, not judging. He gave a small nod that acknowledged their respect without encouraging ceremony. "At ease," he said. The tone was calm, but it carried authority honed over years. They obeyed immediately. Rourke closed the door behind them, sealing off the outside world. "We keep your portrait in the hall," one commander said, voice steady but edged with awe. "It has been years since you visited." Harlan glanced toward the wall where an older photograph hung among the others. A younger version of himself stood there in black and white, eyes sharp, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. Time had added lines to his face, silver to his hair, but the core of him remained unchanged. "Standards are easier to maintain when someone remembers why they were set," Harlan replied. He stepped closer to the table, resting his fingertips lightly on its edge. "I did not come for ceremony," he continued. "I came to see whether this place still understands the weight of its name." The officers exchanged brief looks. Rourke answered without hesitation. "It does." Outside, beyond the closed door, word was already spreading through quiet channels. Not through rumor, but through posture and tone. Operators who had trained for years found themselves replaying the image of their captain standing at attention before a man who wore no visible insignia. At Gate 3, Tyler Briggs remained fixed in place longer than necessary. He could still see the older man's steady gaze, hear the simple request to pass along a name. He felt the edge of his earlier smirk dissolve into something heavier, something closer to humility. Inside the conference room, Harlan straightened and offered a final look around the table. "Good," he said softly. "Then keep it that way." The room absorbed the words without argument. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Only a quiet reaffirmation of purpose. And in that stillness, the men who led the installation understood that legacy was not written in noise. It was written in the way others stood when a certain name was spoken. The conference room remained quiet long after Walter Harlan finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the space with explanations or updates. The officers understood that this was not an inspection in the traditional sense. It was something more personal, more foundational. Captain Benjamin Rourke stepped slightly to the side, allowing Harlan a clear view of the operational map projected across the far wall. Colored lines marked training zones along the Gulf, air corridors extending 20 nautical miles offshore, and new simulation facilities recently added to the installation. "We have expanded our maritime insertion training by 40% over the last 5 years, one commander offered carefully. Increased emphasis on environmental adaptability and decision-making under pressure." Harlan studied the display without visible reaction. His eyes traced the coastline, paused at a highlighted sector near the southern boundary. "Adaptability is not learned in classrooms," he said quietly. "It is learned when something unexpected forces you to think without comfort." The words were not criticism. They were reminder. Rourke nodded once. "We try to build that into every evolution." Harlan shifted his attention from the screen to the men around the table. Trying is not the same as doing. No one argued. Outside the building, the base had resumed motion, but the rhythm was altered. Sailors moved with sharper posture. Voices stayed measured. At Gate 3, Tyler Briggs remained at his post, but his focus had changed. He replayed the moment of salute again in his mind. The precision, the respect. He glanced toward Ethan Cole inside the booth. "You knew something," Briggs said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "I only saw the classification marker." That was enough. Briggs looked back toward the command building, its glass reflecting the fading sun. What kind of file gets locked at command level? Ethan did not answer. He did not need to. Inside the conference room, Harlan stepped away from the table and walked slowly toward the wall of framed citations. One plaque bore a simple inscription beneath an emblem that predated several of the younger officers in the room. The wording was concise, almost understated. It referenced leadership under extreme conditions and the preservation of operational integrity. No dates were listed. No dramatic language. Harlan reached up and straightened the edge of the frame by a fraction of an inch. "You kept this one," he observed. "Yes, sir," Rourke replied. "It is not removed." Harlan allowed the faintest hint of approval to cross his expression. "Good." He turned back toward them, hands folding loosely behind his back. "Names are not important for ego," he continued. "They are important because they represent standards that cannot be negotiated." The officers absorbed the statement without taking notes. They understood it was not meant for documentation. It was meant for memory. After a moment, Harlan inclined his head toward the door. "I will not take more of your time," he said. Rourke moved immediately. "It is not a burden. It should never feel like one," Harlan replied. As they stepped back into the corridor, the hum of the installation filtered in again, steady and disciplined. Word had spread beyond Gate 3 now, not in whispers, but in posture. Sailors who saw Harlan walking beside the captain did not stare. They stood straighter. And at the far edge of the base, beneath the steady movement of the flag against the evening sky, the weight of a single name continued to settle deeper into the foundation of the place. The late afternoon light had shifted toward evening by the time Walter Harlan and Captain Benjamin Rourke stepped back outside. The sky over the installation had softened from sharp blue to a muted gold, long shadows stretching across the pavement like quiet reminders of time past. The air carried the steady scent of salt from the Gulf and aviation fuel from the flight line, familiar and unchanging. Harlan paused at the top of the steps leading down from the command building, his eyes sweeping the base with slow precision. Operators moved across the courtyard in measured strides, gear slung neatly, conversations low and disciplined. No one pointed. No one whispered. But every set of shoulders seemed squared a little tighter. Rourke stood beside him without speaking, allowing the silence to hold its meaning. "You have good men," Harlan said at last. "They are learning," Rourke replied. Harlan gave a faint nod. "Learning is constant. Complacency is quiet." The words were not sharp, but they carried weight. They began walking again toward the interior road that led back toward Gate 3. The distance felt shorter this time. Sailors they passed stepped aside with subtle respect, some offering restrained nods. None demanded explanation. Harlan noticed the new training structure near the far hangar, steel beams rising against the fading light. "Urban simulation?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Rourke answered. 3 levels. Variable layouts. Designed to test adaptability under changing conditions. Harlan studied it for a long moment. "Good. Just remember that adaptability without discipline becomes improvisation without standards." Rourke absorbed the comment without defense. "Understood." As they approached the outer perimeter again, Tyler Briggs stood straighter than he had all day. The earlier confidence in his posture had shifted into something steadier, more reflective. He watched the 2 men approach, noting the absence of spectacle. No escort vehicles. No formal announcement. Just quiet movement and unspoken understanding. Ethan Cole remained inside the booth, headset resting against his collarbone, eyes forward. When Harlan reached the gate, he slowed, glancing once more at the line of operators who had first greeted him with amusement. The memory of that moment lingered in the air, but it no longer carried tension. It carried contrast. Rourke stopped and turned slightly toward Briggs. "Petty Officer Briggs," he said evenly. Briggs stepped forward immediately. "Sir." Rourke held his gaze for a measured second. "Standards begin at the gate." The statement was simple. No reprimand. No raised voice. But it carried unmistakable instruction. Briggs swallowed once. "Yes, sir." Harlan regarded the young SEAL with calm, steady eyes. There was no resentment there. Only expectation. "You asked for a name," Harlan said quietly. "You received one." Briggs felt the words settle deeper than any correction shouted across a parade ground. "Understood," he replied, voice firm now. The flag above them snapped once more in the evening breeze. Harlan extended his hand toward Rourke. The captain shook it with deliberate respect. "We will keep it," Rourke said. I know, Harlan answered. Then, without ceremony, he turned and walked toward the visitor parking area beyond the perimeter. No escort followed him. No fanfare marked his departure. Yet as he moved farther from the gate, the posture of every man present remained altered. The base did not erupt into conversation when he left. It remained measured, deliberate, aware. And at Gate 3, beneath the steady movement of the American flag, Tyler Briggs understood that recognition is not granted by uniform or volume. It is earned quietly, and once earned, it never needs to be announced again. The parking lot beyond the perimeter was nearly empty, the evening sun dipping lower and casting long amber reflections across the windshields of a few scattered vehicles. Walter Harlan walked without hurry, his steps measured, shoulders still square despite the weight of years. Behind him, the gate resumed its rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. Tyler Briggs remained at his post, eyes tracking the older man until he reached a modest pickup parked near the far edge of the lot. The truck was clean but worn, its paint faded slightly by sun and salt air. It did not stand out. Neither had the man who drove it. Briggs felt a quiet pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with understanding. Ethan Cole stepped out of the booth briefly, joining Briggs at the edge of the painted line. You ever hear of him before today? Briggs asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. Not by name. But I looked at the internal archive again after they locked it. There were references to doctrinal revisions from 30 years ago, training protocols that shaped how selection works now. Briggs stared toward the lot. So he built the standard. Or helped define it, Ethan replied. At a level above visibility. In the distance, Harlan paused beside his truck and turned back once, his gaze sweeping the installation one final time. The building stood firm against the sky, antennas cutting clean lines against fading light. The flag at Gate 3 continued its steady motion in the breeze. For a brief second, his expression softened, not with nostalgia, but with confirmation. He opened the truck door and settled into the driver's seat. The engine started with a low, even hum. At the gate, Briggs felt an impulse rise before doubt could suppress it. He stepped forward, coming to attention instinctively. No order had been given. No one required it. Ethan followed suit without hesitation. One by one, the operators near the gate straightened as well, their posture aligning in quiet respect. No salute was exchanged this time. The distance was too great. The moment did not require it. Harlan eased the truck into motion, tires rolling slowly over the asphalt. As he passed the outer boundary, he lifted 2 fingers briefly from the steering wheel in acknowledgement. It was a small gesture. It carried more weight than ceremony. The truck turned onto the access road and began to disappear into the soft glow of the evening. Back at Gate 3, Briggs lowered his hand and exhaled slowly. The earlier confidence that had bordered on arrogance felt different now, tempered and refined. Standards begin at the gate, he repeated quietly to himself. The words no longer sounded like correction. They sounded like responsibility. Ethan glanced toward the command building, where lights had begun to flicker on inside offices and briefing rooms. Some names are not posted on walls, he said. They are built into how the place stands. Briggs nodded once. The flag above them snapped sharply again in the cooling air. The base resumed its usual cadence, vehicles moving, radios murmuring, operators heading toward evening briefings. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, a deeper awareness remained. Walter Harlan had arrived without announcement and left without spectacle. But the silence that followed his name lingered, settling into the foundation of the installation like a permanent reminder. And at Gate 3, under the steady watch of the flag and the fading Texas sky, the men who stood guard understood that respect is not demanded by volume. It is recognized by those who know exactly what it costs to earn it. Night settled gradually over the installation, not with darkness, but with discipline. Floodlights hummed to life along the perimeter, casting clean white beams across the pavement and fencing. Inside the operations building, briefings resumed, doors closing with quiet purpose. At Gate 3, Tyler Briggs stood beneath the glow of the overhead lamps, the earlier heat of the day replaced by a cooler coastal breeze. The events of the afternoon replayed in precise detail in his mind, not as embarrassment, but as instruction. Ethan Cole stepped out of the booth again, holding 2 cups of black coffee. He handed one to Briggs without a word. For a moment, they both watched the steady flow of vehicles entering and exiting the base, identification checked. Barriers rising and lowering in smooth mechanical rhythm. I pulled an old archived bulletin, Ethan said quietly. Internal distribution only. Years ago, it mentioned doctrinal integrity during transitional leadership periods. Briggs glanced sideways. And it referenced a task force led by someone named Harlan. It said the recommendations restructured selection evaluation criteria across multiple commands. Briggs absorbed that in silence. The idea that the man they had nearly dismissed had shaped the very standards they lived by settled heavily in his thoughts. Across the base, a group of new candidates jogged past under supervision, cadence steady, boots striking pavement in unified rhythm. Their faces were determined, unaware of the quiet history that had walked through the gate hours earlier. Briggs watched them with new clarity. "We inherit more than a uniform," he said at last. Ethan nodded. "We inherit expectations." The radio inside the booth crackled briefly with routine updates, weather reports, training confirmations. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. Yet the tone of every transmission felt sharpened, as if awareness itself had become part of the air. In the command building, Captain Benjamin Rourke stood alone in his office for a moment before turning off the overhead lights. He looked once toward the framed photograph in the hallway outside his door. A younger Walter Harlan stared back from the black and white image, expression steady, eyes unyielding. Rourke understood now that leadership was not measured only in active years of service. It was measured in the standards that endured after one stepped away. Back at the gate, a sedan approached slowly, headlights reflecting against the barrier. Briggs stepped forward with composed precision. "Identification, please," he said evenly. The tone carried authority, but it also carried restraint. He examined the credentials carefully, returned them with a nod, and signaled the barrier upward. The vehicle rolled through without incident. Ethan studied him for a moment. "Different day," he observed. Briggs shook his head slightly. "Same day," he corrected. "Different understanding." The flag above them was now lit by a focused beam, its movement visible even against the darkened sky. It did not rest. It never did. Briggs glanced up at it briefly before returning his attention to the road ahead. He thought of the simple instruction given earlier. Standards begin at the gate. The words no longer felt like advice. They felt like obligation. Vehicles continued to pass. Radios murmured. The installation operated with its usual precision. Yet beneath the routine, something intangible had shifted into permanence. A name spoken without decoration had reminded them that legacy does not demand attention. It commands alignment. And as midnight approached over the quiet Texas coast, the men at Gate 3 stood their watch with a deeper awareness that the measure of their service would one day be carried forward the same way, not by volume, but by the silence that followed when their standards were remembered. The hours after midnight carried a different kind of stillness across the installation. Training areas were dark, hangar doors closed, administrative offices quiet. Only essential lights remained, casting pale reflections across polished floors and concrete paths. At Gate 3, the steady rhythm of watch duty continued without complaint. Tyler Briggs stood with composed focus, scanning identification cards beneath the beam of a handheld light, returning each one with measured professionalism. There was no trace of the casual tone that had colored his voice earlier in the day. Ethan Cole monitored the console inside the booth, screens glowing faintly against the dim interior. The night air was cooler now, carrying a distant sound of waves rolling against the coastline beyond the training grounds. "You ever think about how many names pass through here in a year?" Ethan asked quietly through the open booth window. Briggs considered the question while a delivery truck idled 20 feet from the barrier. "Thousands," he answered. "Maybe more." Ethan nodded. "And most of them leave no imprint." Briggs studied the road beyond the gate, the empty stretch illuminated by perimeter lamps. "Some names are not meant to," he said. "Some are meant to anchor everything else." The truck's paperwork checked out. Briggs raised the barrier with a smooth motion, then stepped back into position. The driver gave a brief nod and rolled through. Routine, orderly, precise. Yet beneath the routine, a quiet reflection lingered. Inside the command building, Captain Benjamin Rourke sat alone at his desk, a single lamp illuminating a folder open before him. The folder contained historical memorandums, archived commendations, and strategic recommendations bearing Walter Harlan's signature from decades past. The language was direct, concise, focused on integrity and evaluation standards rather than personal recognition. Rourke closed the folder gently and leaned back, eyes drifting toward the darkened window. Outside, the flag remained visible in the floodlights, moving steadily against the night sky. He understood that leadership was not preserved by ceremony. It was preserved by adherence. Back at the gate, Briggs shifted his stance slightly, boots aligned perfectly with the painted edge of the checkpoint. He remembered the moment earlier when he had stood across from a man who carried no visible insignia, yet commanded the respect of every senior officer on the installation. The realization no longer unsettled him. It steadied him. Standards begin at the gate. He murmured once more, not as repetition, but as commitment. Ethan glanced at him and offered a quiet nod. The radio emitted a brief status update confirming all sectors secure. No incidents reported. Weather clear. Visibility excellent. The installation functioned exactly as designed. A patrol vehicle rolled slowly along the interior perimeter, headlights sweeping across fencing and concrete barriers before continuing on its path. Briggs watched it disappear into the darkness, then returned his attention to the empty stretch of road ahead. He understood now that vigilance was not only about detecting threats. It was about honoring the unseen weight of those who had shaped the foundation beneath his boots. Hours earlier, a single name had shifted the posture of an entire base without command or spectacle. That effect lingered not as tension, but as clarity. As the first hint of dawn began to soften the eastern horizon, pale light touching the edge of the sky, the men at Gate 3 remained steady in their watch. They did not speak of legacy. They did not need to. It stood beside them in every measured movement, in every credential checked, in every barrier raised and lowered with discipline. And in the quiet space between radio transmissions and passing headlights, the understanding endured that true authority is not declared. It is recognized by those who know what it took to build it. Dawn arrived slowly over the Texas coast, a pale line of silver stretching across the horizon before the sun fully committed to the sky. At Gate 3, the night shift gave way to early morning movement. Tyler Briggs remained on post, the last hour of his watch approaching, posture steady despite the long stretch behind him. The floodlights clicked off one by one as natural light strengthened, revealing clean pavement, orderly fencing, and the flag still moving in a disciplined rhythm above the checkpoint. Ethan Cole completed a final log entry inside the booth, documenting routine activity, vehicle counts, and shift transitions. Nothing unusual to report, nothing dramatic. Yet both men understood that the previous day would not be recorded in any official incident column. It did not need to be. A group of trainees jogged past again, this time in the early morning light, breath visible in faint clouds against the cooler air. Their cadence was sharp, synchronized, boots striking concrete with measured force. Briggs watched them pass, recognizing in their stride the same standards that had been discussed inside the command building hours earlier. The standards were invisible, yet unmistakable. A patrol vehicle slowed briefly near the gate, the driver offering a nod of acknowledgement before continuing along the interior perimeter. Briggs returned the gesture with composed precision. His movements were deliberate now, every check of identification thorough, every instruction delivered without unnecessary tone. Ethan stepped outside the booth, stretching slightly as the shift prepared to rotate. "You look different," he said quietly. Briggs kept his eyes on the road. "No," he replied after a moment. "I look the same. I just understand more." Ethan considered that and nodded once. "You think you will come back?" Briggs glanced toward the distant access road where the pickup truck had disappeared the evening before. The road was empty now, sunlight glinting faintly against its surface. "He does not need to," Briggs answered. "He already did what he came to do." Inside the command building, Captain Benjamin Rourke stood at the window of his office, watching the installation wake with quiet purpose. Radios carried calm morning reports. Vehicles moved with measured efficiency. Sailors crossed the courtyard with disciplined focus. He understood that the previous day had not been about recognition for its own sake. It had been about calibration, a reminder that the weight of legacy is measured in adherence, not applause. Back at Gate 3, the relief team approached, uniforms crisp, expressions alert. Briggs briefed them thoroughly, voice steady, tone professional. There was no mention of the previous afternoon. No need to recount it. The lesson had already settled into the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way he watched the road beyond the barrier. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, casting clear light across the installation, the flag caught the wind and extended outward in a sharp line of color. Briggs stepped back from the checkpoint, his watch complete. Before leaving, he paused and looked once more at the painted boundary line beneath his boots. Standards begin at the gate. The phrase no longer felt like a directive from above. It felt like a promise made to those who built the ground he now stood upon. He turned and walked toward the barracks, posture straight, stride even. Behind him, Gate 3 continued its disciplined rhythm. Vehicles approached. Identification was checked. Barriers rose and fell. The base moved forward into a new day, steady and aligned. And somewhere beyond the perimeter, on a quiet stretch of Texas highway, a modest pickup truck carried a man whose name would not need to be spoken loudly again. It had already done its work. The morning carried forward with the steady precision that defined the installation. Sunlight now stretched fully across the parade grounds, reflecting off polished boots and metal railings with a quiet brilliance. Tyler Briggs moved through the barracks corridor after his shift, uniform still crisp despite the long night. The events of the previous day no longer felt like a sharp interruption. They felt like alignment. In the dining facility, conversations were measured, disciplined. No one mentioned the visitor directly, yet the tone of the room held an undercurrent of shared awareness. Standards were not a slogan painted on walls. They were lived in posture and voice. Across the base, training resumed at full pace. Candidates navigated obstacle courses, instructors observed with silent scrutiny, and briefing rooms filled with the calm exchange of operational language. Captain Benjamin Rourke walked the length of the operations floor before midday, offering quiet corrections, steady nods, and measured guidance. He did not reference the previous afternoon, but those who met his eyes understood that the bar had been reaffirmed. In his office, the folder containing historical memorandums remained closed on the corner of his desk. It did not need to be reopened. The reminder had already been delivered in person. Beyond the perimeter, a stretch of Texas highway cut through flat coastal terrain beneath a widening blue sky. A modest pickup truck traveled along it at an even speed, engine humming in steady rhythm. Walter Harlan kept both hands on the steering wheel, gaze fixed ahead. The radio was off. The cabin was quiet except for the low rush of wind against the windows. He did not look back. He did not need to. The installation receded behind him not as a place he had left, but as a standard he had confirmed. In the rearview mirror, the horizon blended into open road. At Gate 3, the new watch team carried out their duties with composed focus. Identification was checked thoroughly. Barriers were raised and lowered with exact timing. No corners were cut. No instructions were delivered casually. The painted boundary line beneath their boots was no longer just a marking on concrete. It was a threshold of responsibility. Ethan Cole completed a routine status update at the console, logging nothing out of the ordinary. Yet he paused for a moment before finalizing the entry, aware that the most important lesson of the previous day would never appear in an official record. It did not need documentation to endure. Tyler Briggs, now off duty, paused briefly outside the barracks before heading inside. He glanced once toward the distant flag visible above the rooftops, its movement constant against the bright sky. The memory of a calm voice asking him to pass along a name remained vivid. The memory of a captain standing at attention remained sharper still. He understood now that authority does not always announce itself with rank or ceremony. Sometimes it arrives quietly, stands firm, and leaves behind a recalibrated understanding of what matters. The base continued its disciplined cadence as the day advanced. Radios carried clear instructions. Training schedules unfolded on time. Operators moved with purpose. Somewhere miles away, a pickup truck rolled onward without escort, without fanfare. Yet within the perimeter of that installation, beneath the steady movement of the American flag, a simple truth had settled into place. Some names do not need to be raised in volume. They raise the standard simply by being remembered.